Climate change isn't as bad as you think. It's worse. Say climate change and see how most people react. I find this a bit like sustainable development, a phrase at which many people quietly glaze over and switch off. So here's the first point. Don't switch off. Climate change isn't just words, it's a real thing. And man-made climate change is a very scary real thing. The rise in global temperature over the last several decades is a matter of public record. There is an overwhelming scientific consensus that it can only be explained by one thing: the rise in greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activities. Some people say that climate change is natural and we shouldn't worry. The answer to that is that we have indeed had naturally occurring climate change since the Earth was formed. But none of the natural causes of climate variation, from the sun's output, the tilt of the Earth, volcanic activity, or emissions from rotting vegetation, can account for the warming we observe today. There is only one thing that can, and that is the emissions from fossil fuels caused by human activities over the last 200 years. The concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere have increased by nearly 30% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's not as bad as you think. It's worse. Here's another inconvenient truth. Not only is global warming happening, it may indeed be speeding up. The 20 warmest years on record have all come since 1995. The 5 warmest years have been in this decade. 2016 was the hottest year since records began. And this year, the United Kingdom had the joint hottest summer on record. It was extremely dry too. The driest across England since 1921. The Environment Agency's hydrologists recorded exceptionally low river flows for 5 weeks in a row. Reservoir stocks were at historic lows, and soils in the northwest were the driest on record. The environment suffered badly. Numerous species, habitats, birds, trees, and aquatic life were affected by the hot conditions and high demand for water. The Environment Agency responded to a 330% increase in drought-related incidents as our teams acted to protect wildlife and rescue fish struggling due to low river flows and low oxygen. This kind of thing won't happen every year, but it will happen more frequently, and it will only be worse. Most of us enjoyed this summer's exceptional weather, but by 2040, it is likely there won't be anything exceptional about summers like the one we have just experienced. The records will keep tumbling. Exceptional may be the new normal. And just as the rate of temperature rise looks to be accelerating, so too does one of its main consequences: the rise in sea level. Over the last 20 years, sea levels have risen at roughly twice the speed of the preceding 80 years. It gets worse. While the international community has pledged to avoid a rise of more than 2 degrees Celsius in the average global temperature by the year 2100, compared with pre-industrial levels, many scientists think that the figure will be higher. The central scientific estimate now is that by 2100, global temperatures will have risen by nearly twice the 2-degree figure, by around 3.5 degrees, it is estimated. Climate change has bad consequences. A second big point to make, and one that bears constant repetition. If we don't tackle climate change, very bad things will happen. Global warming is another of those deceptive phrases. It doesn't sound that threatening. Indeed, to British people shivering in chilly northern on the chilly Northern Ireland island that it is, it sounds rather appealing. Who wouldn't want a bit more sun and the weather a few degrees warmer? But the phrase is misleading because it doesn't identify what will actually happen as the globe warms. The answer is that the tropics will be hotter and drier. The higher latitudes, where the UK sits, will be hotter and wetter. In Britain, the summers will be a lot hotter. By 2040, we expect more than half of summers in Britain to exceed 2003 temperatures. We will have wetter winters, and extreme rainfall events will become even more extreme. Sea levels will rise significantly, perhaps up to a metre in places by the year 2100. As waters warm and take up more space, and our glaciers and land-based ice sheets melt, sea level rises is all tied up with this and is particularly scary. Because while other climate change-driven effects like extreme flooding or drought can do terrible harm, recovery from them is possible. But there is no recovery from a rising sea. It takes land, communities, infrastructure, and everything else away forever, destroying it all. All of these changes in climate will have consequences. They will mean more frequent and more extreme flooding and coastal erosion, caused by those wetter winters, heavier rain, stronger storms, and rising sea levels. All of this threatens us all, because floods destroy lives, livelihoods, and communities. More water shortages and higher drought risk, caused by the hotter, drier summers and less predictable rainfall, all of this could do deep damage to our economy and to our environment. More frequent and more extreme fires and wildfires, such as what we saw in the UK and around the world this summer, often come with terrible human cost. More air and water pollution due to those longer, hotter summers. That will threaten the modern living world of plants and animals, our wider environment, and indeed our own health. More damage to wildlife and the habitat on which it depends, and in many cases that damage may be existential. If we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the same rate as today, then by 2050, 1 million species across the globe are likely to vanish. But disaster is not inevitable. We can indeed tackle this problem. That's bad enough news. Now let's look at the good news. The good news is that it doesn't have to be like this. We can tackle this problem if we act now. Because while some of the effects of climate change, such as increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, wetter winters, and more violent weather in general, will continue for the next 30 to 40 years, no matter what we do, we can affect what happens after that. We know what we need to do. It's summed up by another two words that tend to make people switch off, but which also really matter. Those are mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means addressing the cause of climate change by reducing or stopping the human activities which are affecting the climate system. For example, by cutting our emissions of greenhouse gases. Most of the UK's emissions come from the way we produce and consume energy. I keep saying we here for the UK, but as I said at the beginning, I'm reading somebody else's speech, and I wasn't in the UK this summer, nor am I from the UK. But anyway, most of the UK's emissions come from the way in which we produce and consume energy. From heating our buildings, driving our cars, manufacturing goods, watching our TVs, or boiling our kettles. We can lower our emissions by becoming more energy efficient and switching to renewable or low carbon fuels. Adaptation means making changes to prepare for, reduce, and negate the effects of climate change. For example, by building stronger sea defences to reduce the vulnerability of coastal communities. Other things we can do could be reducing water usage by cutting leakage and extending domestic metering. We could avoid any unnecessary development in floodplains or on fast eroding coastlines. And we could design infrastructure that could be more resistant to the more extreme weather that we know for a fact is on the way. Don't underestimate the power of the people. We've seen an almost overnight change in behaviour in our relation to plastics. We're seeing something similar, if indeed slower, in people's attitudes to water, with more and more of us taking care to use it wisely. It has become socially unacceptable to litter or to use throwaway plastic bags. It is increasingly socially unacceptable to waste water. The same thing can happen, and maybe is happening, with regard to behaviour which stokes climate change. One last bit of good news. While it will cost a lot of money to respond successfully to climate change, we can afford it. Indeed, it's the best investment we could possibly make. It would be much more expensive not to respond. And the economic benefits of mitigating and adapting to climate change, in terms of damage foregone, extra growth achieved through new investment in infrastructure, prosperity boosted through innovative technology, all of these far outweigh the costs. In conclusion, the scandal is not that climate change is made up. The scandal is that it's not. And that while a lot is already being done to tackle it, we are still not doing all we could. That's the scandal. Why is tackling climate change not at the top of everyone's agenda? Partly, no doubt, because most people have busy lives and other things to worry about. Partly because the efforts of a changing climate tend to be invisible and incremental until they are suddenly catastrophic. And maybe too because of the words we use. Language matters. We know that all too well. So here's a final thought. If words like climate change and global warming have become a turn-off for most ordinary people, maybe we should change the words. Perhaps we should indeed talk instead about what these things actually mean. We could refer to killer weather, a world underwater, and a mortgaged future. Many people might not get out of bed to fight something that sounds vaguely technical and non-threatening, like climate change. But pretty much all of us would do something to protect our loved ones, our homes, and our livelihoods, and to build a better world. In conclusion, climate change is too good to be true. So let's tell it like it is. Let's tackle it together, and let's redouble our efforts. Over the last 200 years, humans have comprehensively demonstrated that they can change the climate. And we have changed it for the worse by doing the wrong things. Now, let's show that we can change it for the better by doing the right things.